Hi, my name is Nina Spada. I'm professor in the Language and Literacies Education Program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. I want to thank TESOL Academic for inviting me to prepare this video for the website and to talk about my research interests in the area of communicative language teaching and form-focused instruction. Now, there's actually a set of PowerPoint slides that accompany this talk, and if it's possible to post these slides on the TESOLacademic.org site, then they can be available for you to follow along. So, as I said, I'm going to be speaking about communicative language teaching and form-focused instruction. And I want to start off with talking a little bit about different versions of communicative language teaching. And there are at least two main versions that have been discussed in the literature, the strong version and the weak version. This is how they're referred to in a publication in Anthony Howitt's 1984 book on the history of language teaching methods. The strong version of CLT essentially is that communicative language teaching is an exclusive focus on meaning without any attention to form. That includes explicit instruction and corrective feedback. The weak version of communicative language teaching is one that assumes that there's attention to both form and meaning. Now, the strong version of CLT has led to a number of myths and mythologies and misconceptions, particularly in North America. And for many years, this is where the strong version of CLT actually prevailed. Some of the myths and misconceptions of CLT are that CLT means an exclusive focus on meaning, without any explicit feedback on error, that CLT is learner-centered teaching, that CLT means listening and speaking, and that CLT avoids use of the learner's first language. Now, as most of you know, these myths were the result of a huge pendulum swing that took place within the field of second and foreign language teaching in the 70s and the 80s. This was a movement away from traditional approaches to second language teaching, for example, grammar translation and audiolingual teaching, to communicative language teaching. And these approaches, of course, differed in fundamental ways from CLT. Why was there such a strong reaction against traditional methods of second language teaching? Well, there were many, and some of them were pedagogic. Grammar translation was useful for the study of grammar and vocabulary, but not for speaking and listening, nor was it intended to do that when it was initially conceptualized as an approach to language teaching. Even though audiolingual method focused on speaking and listening, it didn't encourage meaningful communicative practice. And so there was kind of a building fatigue and frustration on the part of teachers and learners with the limitations of dialogue, memorization, and pattern practice drills of the audiolingual method. But there were also research findings to indicate that there were certain limitations and weaknesses with more structure-based approaches. And these included such things as while learners in structure-based programs developed grammatical knowledge, they weren't very successful in using that knowledge. While the research also showed that learners developed fairly good reading comprehension skills, their listening comprehension continued to be challenging. The research also revealed that learners weren't able to use language communicatively, and this was most evident in their speaking skills, but in others as well. And again, is related to the fact that learners had this knowledge of grammar, but were not able to successfully put it to use. Interestingly, this research also revealed that traditional structure-based approaches didn't actually lead to accuracy, which is what the audiolingual approach and all those repetition and memorization and practice drills were all about and intended to accomplish. Now, around the same time that the limitations of more traditional approaches to language teaching were being discussed, there were some new theoretical developments that appeared on the scene, including, for example, the introduction of communicative competence by Dale Hymes in the early 70s. There was the comprehensible input hypothesis proposed by Steve Krashen in North America in 1984, and also the interaction hypothesis. And these, I think, had quite a significant influence on the conceptualization and the understanding and the implementation of communicative language teaching in its various forms. Now, as most of you know, Heim's theory of communicative competence essentially claimed that knowledge of language consists more than a knowledge of the rules of grammar, but also knowledge of the rules of language use. Around the same time, there was the development, I'm sure many of you are familiar with functional linguistics of Halliday, that was related to notions of functional language use, communicative language use, the notion of functional syllabus design. All of this was very much connected to ideas about communicative competence. And what's important to remember about definitions, the definition of the original construct of communicative competence as proposed by Heim's, is that it includes both form and meaning. Now, the comprehensible input hypothesis proposed by Krashen essentially was based on the assumption that while there are similarities between the processes of learning a first language and a second language, there are also differences. Not all second language learners end up being successful learners of a second language, whereas we know that most first language learners, all first language learners, so normally developed first language learners, successfully develop their first language. And this led Krashen to hypothesize that if we could create conditions for second language learners that were more similar to the conditions for first language learners, that might lead to more successful second language learning. And he suggested that this could be accomplished if we expose learners to meaningful and motivating input that is just slightly beyond their current level of development. So just slightly beyond their linguistic ability, but comprehensible enough for them to understand and then to learn through this input. The assumption that was made by Krashen was that L2 learners should be able to integrate this new input into their developing language systems and create a grammar of their second language. Now, although the work of Krashen has been criticized by many researchers because many of the terms are not adequately defined, and it's difficult to actually test several aspects of his theory, many teachers have found his views very appealing, and his work has had a significant influence on the way in which second languages are taught throughout the world, but particularly in North America. Now, the interaction hypothesis, the major assumption of this, was that learners do not need to learn grammar in order to participate in conversations. Rather, second language learners, like first language learners, need to participate in conversations in order to develop a grammar. The combined impact of the input hypothesis and the interaction hypothesis on the evolution of communicative language teaching was significant. And both of them, in my view, contributed to the strong version of communicative language teaching. As I'll discuss in a few moments, the theory of communicative competence, however, relates more to the weak version of CLT, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, what did the research on the strong version of communicative language teaching tell us? Well, as many of you know, a strong version of CLT is often manifested in programs that focus on content, so content-based language teaching, such as you find in French immersion programs in Canada, in CLIL programs in Europe, bilingual education programs in the States, where the focus is on the content, the meaning, in content-based language teaching, the subject matter instruction, and learners learn the second language through that. CLT can also be provided in regular language teaching programs that are heavily oriented toward a focus on meaning, so task-based language teaching, where there's use of authentic themes and tasks, topics, and in comprehension-based programs where the goal is to provide lots and lots of comprehensible input without any focus on language form, so something like the natural approach that was proposed by Krashen and Terrell. What have we learned from research in programs like these? Well, we have learned that learners develop comprehension skills, pretty good comprehension skills, vocabulary knowledge, communicative ability, and communicative confidence, more confidence in their willingness to use the second language. However, it's also been observed in research within the strong version of CLT programs that learners continue to experience difficulties with grammatical accuracy in their oral and written production. So, observations like this lead to the call for more attention to form within communicative instruction. Or rather, observations like this have led to the call in the literature for more of a balance between attention to meaning and attention to form. Because like most things in life, most choices are not dichotomous. It's rather trying to figure out a balance between the two rather than one or the other. So, contributors then to the weak version of CLT, as I said a few moments ago, I consider to be the theory of communicative competence as originally proposed by Del Himes, and also the theoretical work that has been done in form-focused instruction. Now, I believe that the theory of communicative competence is more consistent with the weak version of CLT because, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Himes recognized the value and the necessity for a focus on communicative abilities without the exclusion of the benefits of accuracy and grammatical abilities. This was always considered to be inherently part of the definition of communicative competence. And I think this makes it compatible with what is referred to as in the literature as form-focused instruction, which was introduced in 1997. I introduced the term at that time and defined it in a specific way. It has been used subsequently in the research literature and defined somewhat differently, but I'm going to maintain the definition that I originally proposed for form-focused instruction in this talk by defining it as any effort to draw the learner's attention to form within communicative and meaning-based instruction. That was the way that I had intended and initially discussed form-focused instruction in my 1997 paper in language teaching, where I talked about form-focused instruction being, it could be either implicit or explicit, it could be direct instruction, it could include corrective feedback, but that it was provided always within the context of meaningful practice. So what do we know about research that has been done to investigate the effects of form-focused instruction on L2 learning? Again, the effects of instruction that incorporate a focus on form within meaning-based teaching. Well, over the past 25 years or so, considerable research has been done to investigate the effects of form-focused instruction on learning. And this has included looking at the different ways in which learners' attention can be drawn to form within communicative classrooms. The research has been done with children, adolescents, and adults. And today, the general consensus among second language researchers and teachers is that instruction that is meaning-based and includes attention to form is more effective than instruction which focuses exclusively on meaning or exclusively on form. So again, we're seeing a balance between the two. And the challenge is actually trying to figure out what the best balance is. And other questions that relate to how to best draw learners' attention to form within communicative programs. For example, other questions would include, are there better ways to draw learners' attention to form? And another question would be, do learners develop different types of second language ability depending on the way in which their attention is drawn to form? Let's look at the first question. Are there better ways to draw learners' attention to form? And this has been examined primarily from two perspectives. One is the type of form-focused instruction provided, that is, whether it's explicit or implicit. And another, which has become a focus of my recent research in form-focused instruction, is the timing of FFI, whether it's provided, at what time it's provided within the instructional sequence before, after, or during communicative practice. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But the first question, the type of instruction, is it more beneficial for learners to have their attention drawn to language form explicitly or implicitly within meaning-based instruction? So far, the results seem to indicate that explicit instruction to form is more effective than implicit instruction or attention to form within language teaching. And these results have been reported, for example, in a number of meta-analyses, the Norris and Ortega meta-analysis in 2000 in language learning, another meta-analysis that I did with Yasuo Tomita in 2010, also published in language learning. But even though the overall findings from this research suggest that explicit instruction is more effective, it really depends on what type of knowledge is being measured in these studies. So, for example, some researchers have argued that the reason explicit instruction has been found to be more effective than implicit instruction in many studies is because the studies only measured learners' explicit knowledge. That is, the tests that were used to determine the benefits of these programs were tests that drew on learners' explicit knowledge of grammar, learners' conscious, analyzed knowledge, often referred to as explicit knowledge, and that there were fewer tests that were used in these studies to get at learners' spontaneous ability to rapidly retrieve their knowledge of the language and to use it accurately and appropriately and quickly in spontaneous communication. There are fewer tests like this that have been developed for the assessment of second language development. And therefore, the argument is that until we have more of these tests, it's going to be difficult to make the claims that explicit instruction is more beneficial than implicit instruction when it comes to the development of learners' implicit knowledge. I think we have enough evidence to show that it's beneficial for the development of learners' explicit, conscious, analyzed knowledge, but not for their spontaneous ability to quickly access their language knowledge. Now, the second question that I raised was whether there are better times to provide form-focused instruction is something that I'm particularly interested in investigating and have spent some time working on over the past few years. And that question is, are there better times in the instructional sequence to provide form-focused instruction? Before or after communicative practice, or during communicative practice? Now, Patsy Lightbound and I wrote an article in 2008 that was published in TESOL Quarterly, where we developed a conceptual framework for two types of form-focused instruction that were based on the question of timing. We referred to them as integrated and isolated form-focused instruction. In integrated form-focused instruction, attention to form is always embedded within communicative practice. In isolated form-focused instruction, attention to form is always separate from communicative practice. Now, there are arguments that can be made for both types of instruction. For example, one of the arguments that's often used for isolated form-focused instruction is it's just a natural way to teach, that you, first of all, you present, the teacher presents, and then the learners practice, and this is traditional pedagogy. Another argument for isolated instruction is that you can't pay attention to everything at once, that learners have limited cognitive capacities, particularly low proficient second language learners. They can't pay attention to form and meaning simultaneously. Therefore, it makes sense to separate them, to recognize the difficulties learners have focusing on the two simultaneously. Another argument that has been made for the benefits of isolated form-focused instruction is motivational, that learners will be more motivated because when they're communicating and when they're involved in their communicative tasks, there's no interruption of their communicative interaction, and so therefore they'll be more motivated to participate in these communicative activities and will be less motivated if they were being interrupted and corrected and given information about the language at the same time. So it makes sense to separate them. But there have also, of course, been arguments on the other side for integrated form-focused instruction. Of course, one of the obvious arguments is it's just efficient. You get 2 for 1. If you can do both at the same time, learners are going to be developing both accuracy and fluency simultaneously. And that when they are communicating, when they're engaged in the process of trying to communicate their intentions and their meanings, they're going to receive help immediately when they need it. And that is another argument that's related to motivation as well, from a different perspective, saying that if learners know that immediate help is available when they're communicating, this is going to be provided precisely when they need it in terms of their linguistic development. Now, there's a theory within cognitive psychology that supports both isolated and integrated instruction, and it's referred to as transfer-appropriate processing. And essentially what this theory claims is that when we learn something, whether we learn a word, for example, when we learn a word, we don't only learn the word itself and the meaning of the word, but we also learn, our memories also record the context in which that word was learned. And by context, I mean the cognitive and perceptual processes that were engaged in within that learning moment. So it's not only the item learned, but the cognitive and perceptual processes that were engaged in that context when that particular item of language was initially learned. And subsequently, when we try to retrieve the knowledge that we've learned, so that particular vocabulary item, when we try and retrieve that, we also recall aspects of the learning process. When we try to retrieve it, we're also retrieving other processes, cognitive and perceptual, that were combined with the learning of that language item at the same time. So the claim of transfer-appropriate processing is that the greater the similarity between how we learn something and our later efforts to retrieve it, the greater the chance of success. So just let me repeat that the greater the similarity between how we learn something and our later efforts to retrieve that knowledge, to remember that word, the greater chances of success. So if we extend this to second language learning, we might claim that second language knowledge that is learned in isolated form-focused instruction will be more easily retrieved in isolated form-focused practice. And knowledge that's learned in communicative practice will be more easily retrieved in communicative practice. This hypothesis is perfectly consistent, of course, as I'm sure you recognize, with the observation of many teachers and researchers that students who perform well on grammar tests are not necessarily fluent users and communicators of the language in spontaneous speech. And many fluent language users, many fluent speakers, whose language acquisition maybe took place outside the classroom setting, perform rather poorly on tests of grammar. And so they're not able to retrieve their knowledge, their explicit knowledge, their declarative knowledge, not having had that kind of instruction. So they're retrieving spontaneous fluency that they learned in an acquisition environment, to use Krashen's term, whereas the instructed learners who do very well on grammar tests are not able to retrieve, are very good at retrieving their grammatical knowledge on grammar tests. So that's one of the questions that I was interested in investigating, that I started out to do with my research group at the University of Toronto a few years ago. And I'm going to tell you about one study that we carried out where we had adult ESL learners in 4 classes, and 2 of the classes provided isolated form-focused instruction, and 2 of them provided integrated form-focused instruction. And there were also 2 teachers. One of them taught both the isolated FFI classes, and the other teacher taught both of the integrated FFI classrooms. And the particular language feature that they were teaching was the passive voice, the be passive. So many cars were stolen last year, or the file was deleted from the computer. So that was the target form that both learners were taught in either an isolated form-focused instruction delivery mode or an integrated form-focused instruction approach. Now, it's important to tell you that the instruction that the learners received was provided in 12 hours of class time, so learners received exactly the same amount of instruction over 3 days. The isolated and integrated materials drew on exactly the same content, so that the activities, the content, the themes of the exercises that they were doing was completely the same. And it also provided the same amount of time to focus on form and to focus on meaning. But the big difference was that this was distributed differently. For the integrated instruction, all activities were designed to draw learners' attention to language form and language meaning at the same time. So they were always integrated. The activities always started out with a meaning-based focus, which continued for several minutes, and then form was introduced, and then the learners returned back to meaning, and it was all woven in to the same meaningful-based practice activity. For the isolated form-focused instruction classes, however, learners did their communicative activities and their grammar activities, their form-focused activities, separately. So, for example, what would occur in the isolated form-focused classes is that learners would do a series of activities that drew their attention to the passive voice in very explicit terms. They would do 2 or 3 of those activities, usually throughout the morning, since we had classes where learners were receiving instruction in both the morning and the afternoon. So the morning was the form-focused grammar focus, and the afternoon they did their communicative activities where there wasn't any instruction, there was no corrective feedback, so they had the focus on form and focus on meaning completely separated. That was the only difference between the way in which the instruction was provided in both these classes. And what we did was we gave them a number of different language tests, and this included an error correction task. This was a task where learners were asked to correct incorrect sentences, so they received a number of sentences with the passive form in them, and they were all incorrect, and learners were asked to correct them. That was the error correction task. And then we gave them an oral production task. And in this task, learners were asked to describe a story about a package that was lost in the mail. And the slides and the context were set up in such a way so as to elicit the passive voice. The researcher who was sitting beside the learner during this administration of the oral production task, the researcher sat behind the participant, gave some introductory information about the story, saying that Anna moved to Canada from Mexico. The rest of her family lives in Mexico. Her mother is sending Anna a package of her favorite things. Unfortunately, the package got lost in the mail. Look at these pictures and describe what happened to the package. So, for example, it was expected that the students would describe a picture by using the passive. For example, the package was sent to the wrong house, or it was returned to the post office, etc. So those were 2 very different tasks. We were predicting that learners who received the isolated form-focused instruction would do better on the error correction task, since it was drawing on their explicit, analyzed, declarative knowledge. And learners who received the integrated instruction would do better on the oral production task, since their attention had been drawn to form, always within the context of meaningful practice, so the hypothesis was that they would be able to retrieve their knowledge of the target form, the passive voice, within a communicative context. So these were the kinds of hypotheses that we formulated, of course, based on what I was just telling you about transfer-appropriate processing. The results very briefly showed that both groups improved significantly over time on the passive voice. They both got better on the error correction task, and they both improved on the oral production task. Both classrooms of learners got better. So what these findings suggest is that as long as learners receive a combination of form and meaning-based practice, differences in the actual timing of the attention to form may be less important. I think it would be premature to arrive at this conclusion because this was only one study with a small number of participants, and there have been very few studies that have been done to look at this question before. In fact, no study that has looked at the effects of isolated and integrated form-focused instruction on the acquisition of grammar, to my knowledge. So I think that there was also some other findings from this study which suggested that something might be going on with respect to different kinds of knowledge developing in relation to the different types of form-focused instruction. For example, learners in the isolated form-focused instruction classes did perform better on the error correction task than learners who received the integrated FFI. These differences, however, were not statistically significant. Similarly, learners in the integrated form-focused instruction classes also performed better on the oral production task. However, these differences were not significant either. Nonetheless, I would argue that these results are suggestive of a relationship between how learners' attention is drawn to form and the kind of knowledge that results from this. And I would argue that we need more research in order to investigate this question before we conclude that timing may not be an important issue. So to conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about the different kinds of choices that teachers might make regarding the use of integrated or isolated form-focused instruction. On what basis might teachers decide which one to use, for example? What would be some of the criteria? Well, I think one of them would probably be learners' level of proficiency. We know, for example, that beginning level learners have difficulty focusing on form and meaning at the same time. They always go for meaning. So perhaps with this group of learners, it might be best to provide isolated form-focused instruction. On the other hand, the type of language feature may play a role in making decisions about which one to use. For example, some language features are easier to elicit in communicative activities than others. This might be a good reason for selecting those features for integrated form-focused instruction. If you know that certain kinds of features will naturally emerge in particular linguistic or situational contexts, those might be good targets for integrated form-focused instruction, whereas ones that are more difficult to elicit may require more isolated instruction. Another factor that could figure into making decisions about these two types of approaches could be the first language background of the learners. For example, L2 structures that learners experience difficulty with because of some transfer and some influence of their first language may be more salient. They may notice them much more if they're presented via isolated instruction. They may not notice them as much if they are embedded within communicative practice provided through integrated form-focused instruction. So those are some of the criteria that I think one would want to take into consideration as a teacher when making choices about which particular approach to form-focused instruction one would use for one's learners. So to include, then, I think one can be fairly confident that most of the research in second language instruction and classroom second language instruction has indicated that instruction that focuses on both form and meaning, but not to the exclusion of attention to language form, is the most effective for second language learning. I think most researchers and teachers would agree on this. I think that there's consensus here. Instruction that focuses on both form and meaning is going to be the most effective for second language learning. However, there are many more questions that need to be investigated, and they include how attention to form is best provided, when attention to form is best provided, and also how do specific language forms and learner characteristics interact with how and when attention to form is best provided. So there are many, many more questions out there for us to investigate, leaving us with lots of work to do in the future. So I thank you for listening, and I thank TESOL Academic Talk Board again for inviting me. And I hope that the slides for this presentation can be made available online for you as well. Okay, bye-bye.